Hello, subscribers. Today we will be looking at a video from the Magic Skeptic titled, Ignorant Christian Tries to Dismiss Atheism, the Most Annoying Religious People. Not sure what he finds annoying about reasoned arguments. Maybe he's getting defensive. It's obviously a response to capturing Christianity's somewhat recent video explaining that even if atheists' quote, best argument was right, atheism still wouldn't follow. Let's see what he's got.
Let's find out what Cameron is talking about and dive right in. I hope you enjoy it.
What's up everyone, Cam here. In this video, I'm telling you the story of how after 10 years of study, I no longer take atheism seriously. There are very powerful arguments for God's existence. I found the Kalam cosmological argument, contingency arguments, teleological arguments from fine-tuning, arguments from consciousness, moral arguments, and so on. Like there's actually a ton of arguments for the existence of God. Check out this video, got it linked right here, in which we lay out over 150 arguments for God's existence that show up in the literature. Now, this might lead you to think that this kind of like settles the matter. Like, don't all of these arguments for God's existence prove that atheism is unreasonable? Well, not so fast. Okay, first of all, every single argument has responses from atheists, and you've kind of got to do the work going through those responses.
Yeah.
And we're being very generous to the atheists and saying that all of these arguments are weak.
Generous. I mean, you see how the power of these arguments magnifies so quickly when you put them together.
So Cameron's guest alleges that even a compendium of weak arguments serves as evidence which renders God's existence a near certainty.
Yeah, it basically confirms God's existence.
And in response, a commenter correctly identifies the fact that the same tortured mathematical process could be done with the arguments for atheism.
All right, one of the things that people are saying in the comments in the live chat, and we even talked about this a little bit, is that an atheist could equally make a list of all of these arguments for atheism. And even Felipe Leon has, I think, a list of about 100 on his website for atheism. So, shouldn't we try to calculate that in with these numbers? How would that interact with what we've done today?
And what do we get in response? How does Cameron's guest resolve this tension? Easy. He just asserts that atheist arguments are dealt with by theistic responses.
I just offhand, I'm not sure how I would factor that into the actual calculations that we're doing. If you have planning as free will defense and some workable version of skeptical theism, well, that takes care of arguments from evil. And if you have Nagasawa's maximal God thesis, that takes care of coherence arguments. What's left for atheistic arguments?
Huh. So it's that easy to do philosophy, huh? Well, in that case, good sir, I'm going to go ahead and assert that theistic arguments are dealt with quite well by the problem of evil, by divine hiddenness, and by the sheer lack of empirical evidence.
That is not how it works. And luckily the transcript button was working for this video. Free will directly refutes the problem of evil, but the problem of evil does not directly refute the Kalam, teleological, or transcendental, or many others. This is such a blatantly obvious equivocation. And the quote, lack of empirical evidence is just begging the question, you not liking the evidence doesn't mean it's not there.
Suffice to say, I think this meta-argument is an extremely poor attempt, and I think Cameron's reputation is sullied by association. I mean, Cameron doesn't even push back. In fact, he appears to lean in the direction that the cumulative case is a fair one. But don't take my word for it. Have a listen.
If there's still 50 weak arguments, in addition, if the arguments for atheism and arguments for theism could cancel out in that way, then a number of 50 arguments that are still weak would still highly confirm theism.
And Cameron has the audacity to tell us that he doesn't take atheism seriously anymore?
Yeah. Were you not listening? Did you not just see for yourself how pathetic the atheistic arguments are? Are you laughing to hide your shame?
But just in case you're not convinced by my indignation, consider this. Cameron doesn't believe in reincarnation, yet there's a rich history of arguments which attempt to demonstrate the truth of this phenomenon. There are moral arguments where reincarnation is alleged to provide a way of addressing injustices. There are arguments based on the phenomenon of past life memories, where specific details are recalled by individuals despite the seemingly inaccessible nature of those details. For example, cases where children recall specific names and death circumstances which line up with real individuals who passed away. There are arguments based on unexplained abilities and phobias, where some people are born with exceptional talents or profound fears that appear inexplicable based on current life experience. There are arguments based on déjà vu, where individuals feel like they've been somewhere before. This despite the fact that such individuals have never visited the location in question, in this life at least. I could go on, but suffice to say there's a compendium of arguments and variation of arguments which comprise a vast literature surrounding reincarnation. So if we're to take Cameron and Co.'s reasoning seriously here, we have very strong evidence for the truth of reincarnation. After all, the sheer number of arguments for something counts as evidence. Such arguments, taken as a cumulative case, constitute powerful evidence for reincarnation, even if each individual argument is quite weak.
I certainly didn't expect an atheist to argue for reincarnation, and it was better than that one guy who got all his information from ChatGPT. But reincarnation is irrational to the point that even if it were true, it would be better not to believe it, unless, of course, we really did retain the memories from past lives. If we don't retain the memories, then it's no different than annihilation. Whoever you were in a past life just doesn't exist anymore. Therefore, it's indistinguishable from life without reincarnation. But even still, the reincarnation arguments aren't just weak, they're bad. First, reincarnation does not deal with injustice. If Hitler was reincarnated as a dung beetle, then I'm sure he would be perfectly happy. He wouldn't remember anything he did, so he wouldn't feel like his life was a punishment. And it wouldn't be, because if a person does not remember anything about what led to their punishment, then the punishment is meaningless at best, and not even a punishment at worst. Second, remembering some specific detail you should not have known is not even close to remembering who you were in the alleged past life, and more than that, if it were true, then everybody should have these experiences, or even just the majority of people. But instead, it's so few that I'm not even sure you're not just regurgitating something you saw in an episode of The X-Files or something. And of course, said memories could be explained by demonic shenanigans. Third, unexplained abilities and phobias just sounds completely ad hoc. Some people are just wired different. This is one of those arguments that are consistent with the theory but don't actually make it any more likely to be true. Fourth, déjà vu is an especially bad argument for reincarnation because you can get déjà vu just from smells. Fourth, déjà vu is an especially bad argument for reincarnation because you can get déjà vu just from smells. Unless you can prove we have the memories from a past life, it will be irrational to believe in reincarnation, no matter how many ad hoc theories you give it.
So you see, it's trivially easy to take this kind of reasoning and use it to establish the existence of any woo of your choosing. All you have to do is erect a compendium of weak arguments, and bingo, your job is done.
Except, you're not actually doing the work now, are you? Remember what Cameron said earlier.
Don't all of these arguments for God's existence prove that atheism is unreasonable? Well, not so fast. Okay, first of all, every single argument has responses from atheists, and you've kind of got to do the work going through those responses.
So erecting a compendium of arguments is not all you have to do.
Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I've found, is the problem of evil. The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism. So why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism? Well, simply because there are many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out. The British philosopher Philip Goff is a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power. A God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do. Is this or nothing?
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can like stop all of the suffering in the world.
In short, and according to Cameron, atheism is untenable because even if the problem of evil succeeds, all it succeeds in doing is debunking particular gods. It doesn't establish the so-called global atheist case. As Cameron argues, assuming the success of the problem of evil, an all-powerful and all-loving God may be off the table, but pointless suffering is still reconcilable with an all-loving God whose powers are limited in such a manner as to make the prevention of pointless suffering impossible.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can like stop all of the suffering in the world.
Pointless evil is equally reconcilable, one may argue, with an evil God and so forth.
I have to stop you there. An evil God is an oxymoron. I don't remember if Cameron himself mentioned an evil God as a possibility, but it is a hill which I will die on. Saying evil God is no different than saying square circle or one-ended stick. It's just not a thing. An evil God can only make sense in a pantheon where you have this weak definition of God. But with a proper definition of God, where he is the creator of all things, then it is not possible for him to be evil.
Cameron acts as though this insight is a devastating blow to the atheist position. But the truth is, this isn't a particularly persuasive point because, as I understand it, the problem of evil doesn't address all gods, nor is it designed to. The problem of evil attacks the God of classical theism, that is, an all-loving and all-powerful God. So it's a pretty hollow victory for Cameron to suggest that atheism is somehow lacking simply because the problem of evil doesn't rule out all God concepts, something which the argument isn't intended to do in the first place. By way of analogy, this would be like me declaring victory against theism, because even if I grant the first phase of the Kalam cosmological argument, that still doesn't establish the existence of the Christian God. It only establishes that the universe had a cause. Therefore, I'm not going to take theism seriously anymore.
I know this is my first time ever seeing the magic skeptic before, but that last point, nevertheless, feels more than a bit ironic. Anyway, the problem of evil was just one example, but Cameron's argument works for any atheistic argument. The only way atheists can argue is to argue against a specific God. You could defeat any atheist argument by just proposing a definitionally weak God, and the atheist has to have reasons why that particular God does not exist, because atheism is to disbelieve in all gods, not just some gods. Okay, I'm gonna have to trim a lot out of there somewhere, so I will just summarize what he said. Basically, he said that the process God would still have his own problem of evil. But considering you could always just weaken your definition of God, I don't think that's really the case. Like, the problem of evil is of course being used here to disprove God, but if God is not omnibenevolent, then evil would say nothing about his existence one way or the other.
Now, just to be clear, this problem of evil doesn't establish the non-existence of God either, but that wasn't my intention. I'm merely addressing Cameron's ludicrous claim that the problem of evil doesn't touch the God of process thought.
Like, it doesn't touch it at all.
Clearly, and as I hope I've demonstrated in my counter-argument, limited God hypotheses are affected by the problem of evil, so long as the God that's being articulated is alleged to be all-loving.
Lowell, yes. And if you're willing to claim God is not all-powerful, then why not claim he's not all-loving either? Atheism just can't justify its own belief that there are no gods whatsoever.
The problem of evil manifests once again. Sure, the problem of evil doesn't rule out a limited God hypothesis, but it does demonstrate that such a God may in fact be wicked as well as being impotent. But as always, dear listener, you can be the judge.
Think about it like this. Okay, scientists used to believe that the speed of light was infinite, When we discovered evidence that the speed of light was finite instead of infinite, we didn't conclude that there's like no such thing as light, right? We modified our concept of the speed of light, one of the properties of light. So what I'm saying here is that the best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists.
Yes, Cameron. Scientists do in fact revise their theories when new evidence comes along. But that's not the same as revising your description of God every time you encounter a challenge. The scientific method and ad hoc reasoning are not the same. The former discards falsified propositions, whereas the latter preserves propositions by rendering them unfalsifiable. For example, miasma theory, a theory of medicine which maintained that diseases and infections were caused by foul-smelling odors, was once at the cutting edge of medical science. Based on Greek and Roman medical practices, this theory was widely accepted up to and including the 19th century, if you could imagine. Ultimately, of course, the miasma theory was abandoned because the evidence doesn't stack up. The germ theory of disease overtook it, and here we are today. If science and religion were comparable in the manner that Cameron suggests, scientists would still be articulating the miasma theory today. They would be coming up with all sorts of ad hoc justifications which demonstrate the truth of miasma theory, despite the fact that there's no evidence to support it. If scientists were like theologians, then every time a disease or infection occurred in the absence of a foul-smelling odor, defenders of miasma would jump to its defense, suggesting that this is one of those cases where the smell in question is odorless.
I'm sure that sounded convincing, but a couple things to bring up. First, bacteria tends to cause bad smells, so it's not like the miasma theory was way off base. That probably doesn't mean anything for this context. I just felt like saying it. Second, this isn't about people weakening their own definition of God to not become atheists. It's about how atheism is irrational. For example, atheist X claims no God exists, and you ask, what about God Y? If he gives a reason, you can say, but what about this weaker version called God Z? Eventually, atheist X will hit a wall where all his arguments fail to disprove a certain definition of God. So regardless of your belief, believing in no God will always be less rational than believing in some God.
The point is, it's trivially easy to render God unfalsifiable if you're willing to throw rationality and reason out the window. And the same is true for miasma theory. All one need do is table the notion that some of these odors are insensible to us. Job done. But we don't see this happening in the real world, do we? We don't see scientists clutching at straws, holding on to the miasma theory just because it hails from antiquity. Instead, we see a universal abandonment of miasma theory because the evidence doesn't stack up. This is not what happens in the case of God. The absence of evidence for God is no problem for theists,
in the sense that there is no absence of evidence. There is an abundance of evidence.
Hey, theist, I can't see God. Oh, but that's because God is invisible. Hey, theist, I can't hear God. Oh, that's because God is silent. Hey, theist, I can't smell God. Oh, that's because God is odorless. Hey, theist, I can't feel God. Oh, that's okay. It's because God is intangible, etc. Every time somebody points out the hiddenness of God, every single time somebody points out the eternally elusive, inaccessible, and unobservable nature of God, theists are quick to come up with some kind of ad hoc justification which preserves their belief. In short, they render the God hypothesis unfalsifiable.
God is not inaccessible. He wrote a book. You can access him there and in prayer. And of course, you can see his handiwork everywhere. And it's not ad hoc to give the logical explanation of why he can't be seen unless he chooses to be seen. Just because you can strawman to make it sound that way doesn't mean it is.
Suffice to say, Cameron's contention that science and religion are the same insofar as they preserve the belief in their pet theories is garbage. This is not the case. Science and religion are the opposite.
Science came from religion. That's not how opposites work.
Science falsifies things and moves on. Religion preserves things by rendering them unfalsifiable to begin with.
So are you saying evolution is a religion now?
The best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists.
Translation. It doesn't matter how strong a challenge you offer, I can always manipulate, massage, and update my God concept in order to preserve it. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the preservation of Cameron's belief in God is constrained only by his creativity.
I'm just going to have to say this again. It is not about preserving our belief. It's about the would-be atheist preserving some form of rationality.
The theist whose God is infinitely malleable, changeable, and redefinable. And again, to remind you, Cameron isn't taking atheism seriously anymore. Oh no! What will we do without him?
Something else important I want you to notice is that the same cannot be said of arguments for God's existence. Like if we grant that the arguments go through for God's existence, then they would actually prove that at least one God is real. So the move that I'm making here by like hypothetically granting their argument is not available to the atheists. They can't hypothetically grant the arguments for theism. Instead, they just sort of have to trust that every argument for God's existence fails, even the ones they've never heard of, which is actually kind of a giant leap of faith if you think about it.
More hogwash. I could grant Paley's watchmaker, and such a concession doesn't establish a god, only a designer. Who's to say that said designer isn't an alien? I could grant various contingency arguments, and all that's established is that the universe is contingent, leaving open the question as to what the universe is contingent upon.
And I believe you just proved my point. You've completely left rationality at the door in order to hold on to your atheism. Just from that first example, the design argument goes much further than anything a mere alien could accomplish. The entire universe is designed, not just life on Earth.
And last, but by no means least, it would be remiss of me not to address this preposterous allegation that atheists are engaged in some kind of faith-based endeavor, insofar as they have to trust that all of the arguments for God's existence fail, including those that they haven't encountered yet.
They just sort of have to trust that every argument for God's existence fails, even the ones they've never heard of, which is actually kind of a giant leap of faith if you think about it.
No, Cameron, that is absurd. Leaving aside the obvious projection that's on offer here, I could just flip the script. Consider the following. Theists just have to trust that every argument for God's non-existence fails.
No, we don't. Were you really not listening? The whole point of Cameron saying atheists have to trust that the theist arguments fail is because they can't even concede one of the arguments, even for the sake of argument. We, on the other hand, could conceivably concede any atheist argument, because all atheist arguments only deal with specific gods, not the idea of gods in general. Provided, of course, we aren't arguing for a specific god. Well, that wasn't so bad. His intro had me expecting much more mockery than there was. And in spite of all his mistakes, which are expected from atheists, I don't think he was that far off base. Don't get me wrong, I stand behind Cameron's reasoning here. Atheism is irrational. Even believing in the most incorrect view of God you can have is still more rational than atheism. But defining God as anything less than the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, creator of absolutely everything is irrational, and does have a tinge of unfalsifiability to it, and Cameron should deal with that himself. One thing that bugs me, though, is that he never did explain what he found annoying about Cameron, and I didn't see a hint of magic.